0430 hours, June 4th, 1942. The Pacific sky was still black, a heavy dome pressing down on the coral atoll of Midway. In a wooden shack tucked behind sandbags, two young Marines leaned over a glowing cathode ray tube. The hummed with the metallic thrum of its generator, vacuum tubes heating the room until sweat beaded on their foreheads despite the cool dawn air outside. The smell inside was an odd blend of salt spray, hot wiring, and kerosene from the lamps. SCR-270 radar set. The radar had played tricks all night, throwing ghost echoes of rain squalls and seabirds across the screen. But now the blips were different, larger, steadier, moving with purpose. One operator scribbled a bearing, his pencil vibrating from the generator's rumble. Contact. Bearing 320, range 85 miles. His partner repeated it into the phone line with a voice that quivered but stayed steady enough for the duty officer to understand. This was no exercise. The largest Japanese carrier force ever assembled steamed toward Midway, and these two Marines, barely old enough to vote back home, were the first Americans to see it. 6 months earlier, on the morning of December 7, 1941, another SCR-270 had spotted the Pearl Harbor raid. That warning was dismissed, lost in the fog of disbelief and routine. At Midway, no one dared make that mistake again. Within minutes, the report shot from shack to operations center to pilots climbing into cockpits. Engines roared to life on the atoll's runways, even as the radar operators stared at the sweeping green line on their scope. The SCR-270 was crude by any modern measure, operating around 106 megahertz with a maximum detection range of about 140 miles for bomber formations. Its ungainly antenna stretched longer than a football field, looking more like farm scaffolding than a weapon. But in 1942, it was nothing short of sorcery. Where Japanese aviators trusted only their eyes, America had begun to trust electrons. By 1943, the United States would field more operational radar stations across the Pacific than Japan possessed in its entire empire, an impossible statistic that foreshadowed the collapse of Japanese surprise tactics. Out over the ocean, Japanese doctrine still rested on invisibility. Appear from nowhere, strike without warning, vanish before the enemy could react. At Pearl Harbor, it had worked perfectly. At Midway, it was unraveling. As the strike force closed the distance expecting sleepy defenses, American fighters were already climbing to meet them. Later, in post-war interrogations, Japanese staff officer Captain Takahisa Amagi would be asked how the Americans could possibly have known where to send their interceptors. His answer was brief, almost dismissive: by radar. It was an experiment at Midway. He could not know then that the experiment was becoming standard practice. For the first time, Japan's mastery of surprise had been broken by an invisible beam. Inside the shack, the Marines could not see the fight they had unleashed. They could only hear faint reports crackling back, wildcats diving, Zeros twisting, bombers scattering under sudden attack. They could not know that their radar call had bought Midway precious minutes, enough for Marine fighters to blunt the edge of the attack. Nor could they know that later that same day, American dive bombers would sink 4 Japanese carriers, a blow from which the Empire's naval air arm would never recover. Still, radar was no magic shield. American torpedo squadrons went in blind and were almost annihilated. Without accurate height finding, controllers worked from guesswork as often as science. The blips on the scope told only part of the story. Men still burned in cockpits, planes still fell into the sea. The operators in the shack simply logged ranges and bearings, aware that each sweep of the line might mark another man's death. When their shift ended, the 2 Marines stepped outside into the growing daylight. The lagoon glittered as though nothing had happened, but smoke trails on the horizon betrayed the truth. The Pacific War had shifted in a single morning. For the first time, Japanese aviators discovered that the Americans could see them before they struck. The invisible beams that had swept across the dawn sky would redraw the war's horizons. The rising sun glinted off the canopies of the Japanese strike force as it pushed eastward. A formation of Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers droned steadily, their engines humming like a swarm of locusts over the endless Pacific. Pilots scanned the horizon with disciplined eyes. The attack plan had been rehearsed down to the minute: arrive unseen, smash Midway's defenses, and return to carriers waiting patiently beyond the horizon. The doctrine was proven. Surprise was their sharpest weapon, and this morning it should have been absolute. Then came the first streaks of tracer fire. Out of the cloud banks above them, American fighters slashed down like hawks, the stubby silhouettes of F-4F Wildcats cutting into the formation. Zeros scrambled to intercept, but the cohesion of the strike force wavered immediately. A torpedo bomber veered left to avoid a diving Wildcat, nearly colliding with its wingman. Another burst into flames before its crew could even spot the enemy that hit them. Japanese pilots had expected calm skies until Midway came into view. Instead, they were ambushed in the open ocean. For the Japanese airmen, the encounter was bewildering. How could Americans possibly know they were coming? The range was too great for scouts. No human lookout could have spotted them against the vast emptiness of the Pacific. In the cockpit, one ensign craned his neck and muttered to himself in disbelief. Later, survivors would learn the truth. It had been radar. The CXAM shipboard radar, installed on several U.S. carriers and battleships by 1942, could detect high-flying aircraft at ranges up to 70 nautical miles. Combined with the shore-based SCR-270 at Midway, the Americans had stitched together an invisible web of detection. Their controllers did not always know altitude, but they had bearings and distance. That was enough to vector fighters to the right patch of sky, where trained eyes could take over. In post-war interrogations, Captain Takahisa Amagi recalled the surprise with blunt honesty. Asked how the defenders knew where to place their fighters, he answered simply, "By radar." It was an experiment at Midway. His tone suggested skepticism, perhaps even dismissal, but the fact remained. Radar had destroyed the illusion of Japanese invisibility. For the American pilots climbing into combat, the experience was just as surreal, though from the opposite perspective. Lieutenant Charles Hughes, strapped into his Wildcat, would later remember being vectored toward a heading that made little sense to him at first. He saw nothing but empty water until faint specks grew into enemy bombers. "They put us in the right place before our eyes could," he recalled, giving credit to the unseen hand that guided them. The clash was brief, violent, and costly. Wildcats shredded portions of the Japanese strike, forcing bombers to jettison ordnance early or scatter before regrouping. Yet the defenders also paid in blood. Midway's small fighter garrison was mauled, outnumbered, and flying older aircraft against agile Zeros. Still, the damage was done. The Japanese had been intercepted far from their target. Their sense of invulnerability fractured. What unfolded over the next hours, the sacrifice of American torpedo squadrons, the miraculous dive bomber strikes that sank 4 carriers, would become the stuff of legend. But the psychological turning point for many Japanese aviators had already come in those first few minutes after dawn. Surprise had failed them. They had been seen before striking. For an empire built on the creed of the lightning blow, this was more than tactical inconvenience. It was a crack in the foundation of doctrine. Their leaders had trained them to expect hesitation, blindness, and confusion from the Americans. Instead, they met an enemy guided by invisible technology, one that could turn darkness and distance into warning. By the time the battered survivors turned back toward their carriers, many carried the unspoken realization that their war had entered a new dimension. They had been bested not just by pilots, but by something they could not fight, an invisible weapon that pierced the Pacific's vastness. That morning's illusion died hard in smoke and seawater. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese aviators discovered what it felt like to be hunted before they even reached the battlefield. The sun climbed higher over Midway, burning away the last shadows of dawn. Above the atoll, the air had become a cauldron of smoke trails and flaming debris. Marines on the ground squinted against the glare as aircraft tangled in twisting duels overhead. The roar of engines and the crack of machine guns carried over the lagoon, broken by the occasional thunder of bombs falling wide. Inside the radar shack, the Marines who had first spotted the enemy could only listen to the chaos they had unleashed. Reports crackled across the radio net, jagged voices drowned in static. Zeros coming down hard, then silence. The radar screen itself was indifferent, its green sweep moving in calm repetition. To the men watching, every new blip that edged closer was a possible death sentence for a friend already in the sky. Radar had done its job. It had stripped away surprise, given Midway's defenders a chance. But in those early hours, it could not promise victory. American fighter pilots were badly outnumbered, many flying obsolete aircraft. The stubby Brewster Buffaloes, already infamous for sluggish performance, were cut apart by faster Zeros. The more rugged Wildcats fared better, but losses were heavy. In the first clash alone, nearly half of Midway's fighters were shot down or crippled. Down at sea level, another kind of sacrifice was unfolding. Torpedo Squadron 8 launched from the carrier Hornet with 15 TBD Devastators, lumbering aircraft already outdated when the war began. Lacking fighter escort and armed with faulty torpedoes, they pressed on through curtains of flak and swarming Zeros. One by one they were shot from the sky. 14 of the 15 planes were destroyed. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, floated alive in the wreckage to tell the tale. Radar had guided them into battle, but it could not shield them from the brutal mathematics of outdated machines against seasoned defenders. This was the paradox of Midway. America could now see its enemy before the first bomb fell, yet the defenders still bled heavily to hold the line. Radar was a tool, not a talisman. Without altitude data, controllers could only estimate heights. Communications were limited to voice radios, vulnerable to static and interference. More than once, fighters were vectored too high or too low, arriving seconds too late to prevent a bombing run. The technology was ahead of the tactics, and men paid the difference in their lives. Still, the cracks in Japanese doctrine widened. For the first time, enemy pilots had been forced to fight their way toward a target rather than descend on it unopposed. Some were rattled enough to drop bombs early. Others arrived scattered and late. A strike meant to overwhelm Midway instead bled away momentum before it ever reached the atoll. When American dive bombers finally struck back later that morning, plunging from the sun to destroy 4 Japanese carriers, the opportunity had been prepared by that radar shack and its blips in the dark. The early warning had preserved Midway's airfields and bought just enough time for those dive bombers to launch. It was a victory won not only by aviators, but by electrons humming through copper wires. For the men in the shack, none of this grandeur was visible. They kept scribbling ranges and bearings, repeating them into the phone with voices that grew hoarse. Outside, the horizon shimmered in heat and smoke. Midway still stood, battered but unbroken. When they finally stepped out into the sunlight, they saw wreckage drifting in the lagoon and oil slicks stretching across the sea. They understood only this: their strange machine had given the Americans a chance, and the Japanese now knew they could be seen before they struck. The first blood of radar warfare had been spilled. The experiment was no longer theory, it was war. The year was 1943, and aboard the carrier USS Enterprise, a new kind of room pulsed with activity. It was dark, lit only by the glow of plotting boards and the steady sweep of radar scopes. Voices spoke in clipped precision, stripped of anything unnecessary. Grease pencils squeaked on plexiglass as tracks were marked and updated. This was the Combat Information Center, the CIC, a place that had not existed at the start of the war, but now stood as the fleet's brain. The idea was deceptively simple. Take the strange echoes from radar, fuse them with reports from scouts and patrols, and direct the fleet's defenses from a single nerve center. In practice, it required discipline and training on an industrial scale. Officers became fighter directors, mastering the art of guiding airborne CAP squadrons by voice command. Enlisted men and women, many fresh from high school, learned to interpret scope readings with speed and confidence. By mid-1943, the CIC had transformed radar from a fragile experiment into doctrine. Radar sets themselves were advancing quickly. The Navy's SM Fighter Direction Radar, operating in the microwave band, could detect aircraft with far greater accuracy than the older CXAM. Ranges of 35 miles for fighters and more for bombers meant controllers could now vector interceptors with remarkable precision. Combined with height-finding gear, the CIC could place Hellcats directly into the path of incoming raids before the enemy ever saw the carriers. Back home, the training pipeline swelled. At radar schools on the east and west coasts, entire classes of operators cycled through every few weeks. Ensign Margaret Doyle, a fictional but representative wave, sat in a classroom at Harvard's radio school surrounded by women in crisp uniforms, headphones clamped to their ears as they practiced tracking phantom echoes. She would recall the metallic tang of the headsets, the endless drills of plot and report, and the sense that she was part of something vast. "We were learning to see without eyes," she might have said, and to teach pilots to trust shadows. Her experience was repeated thousands of times over. By 1944, the U.S. Navy had trained over 10,000 radar specialists, more men and women than Japan had combat pilots left. For the sailors in the CIC, life took on a rhythm as mechanical as it was nerve-wracking. Air raids could come at any time, and the job was to keep the picture clear. A fighter director officer would call out, "Vector red section, Angels 10, bogies bearing 090, range 25. Somewhere in the darkness above the Pacific, two Hellcats would bank hard, trusting those words more than their own eyes. When guns roared and reports came back, "Splash one bandit," cheers were muted, almost ritual. They knew another blip was already inbound. Japanese doctrine had no answer for this. Their pilots flew brave and skilled, but without a centralized system to fuse information. They remained bound by what their eyes could see. The Americans were now fighting in two dimensions, one visible, one electronic. And the electronic always came first. The CIC was a temple to modern war, humming with vacuum tubes and discipline. It represented something more than technology, the transformation of American society into a force where civilians, trained in months, could operate equipment more advanced than anything Japan had fielded in decades. Industrial democracy was not only producing more planes and ships, it was producing vision itself, in quantities the enemy could not match. As the Enterprise steamed westward, her CIC stood watch every hour of every day. The glowing scopes and murmured commands became the fleet's shield. When Japanese aircraft finally appeared on the horizon, the Hellcats were already climbing, guided by voices from a room the enemy didn't even know existed. What began in a shack on Midway had become the eyes of the fleet. June 19th, 1944. The Western Pacific shimmered with summer heat as Task Force 58 steamed in formation, its carriers forming a steel rectangle across the water. Below decks, sailors prepared bombs, loaded belts of .50 caliber ammunition, and checked fire control radars. Above, the skies seemed deceptively empty, but in the darkened combat information centers, the scopes were already alive. Blips swarmed at the edge of the screens, more than 100 aircraft rising from Japanese carriers hundreds of miles away. Raid detected bearing 270, range 150. The report moved instantly through the CIC of USS Lexington. A fighter director officer marked the track, then barked into his handset. Vector Blue Squadron, Angels 15, Bogies 270, range 100. The calm voice disguised the enormity of what was happening. American fighters were being sent to meet the Japanese long before either side could see the other. This was the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and it would be remembered by the nickname that captured its lopsided nature, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The reason for that slaughter was not simply the skill of U.S. pilots or the ruggedness of their F-6F Hellcats, though both mattered. It was radar. For the first time, Japanese carrier raids were tracked continuously from launch to interception. Surprise once their most potent weapon was gone. The numbers told the story better than any single account. More than 300 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in the first day alone. The U.S. lost only 29 fighters in combat. For every American plane that fell, more than 10 Japanese were shot from the sky. It was an exchange ratio so staggering that veterans later struggled to describe it without sounding boastful. It wasn't a fight, one pilot admitted. It was a harvest. The mechanics of the slaughter were as systematic as they were merciless. As radar tracked inbound raids, CAP fighters were vectored in layers. The first interceptors struck at long range, breaking apart the formations. Survivors pressed on, only to be met by a second wave of Hellcats guided into position by updated vectors. Those who reached the fleet found themselves flying into walls of radar-directed anti-aircraft fire, shells fitted with VT proximity fuses that detonated in the air with uncanny precision. Few made it through. From the Japanese perspective, the shock was profound. Pilots launched with confidence, trained in tactics that assumed American defenses would be blind until the very last moment. Instead, they found enemy fighters waiting where none should have been. One survivor later wrote that it felt as if the Americans had eyes in the sky themselves. He was not wrong. The invisible sweep of radar had made the Pacific transparent. For the Americans, the battle was confirmation that their system worked. CIC operators, many barely out of training school, spoke with the calm of professionals as they guided squadron after squadron. A controller might never see the ocean during his watch, but his words sent men into combat at exactly the right place and time. Pilots learned to trust those unseen voices more than their own instincts. The relationship was intimate, almost eerie. Young men steering machines through the air on nothing but bearings and ranges, called out from a glowing screen below decks. By nightfall, Japanese naval aviation was broken. Carriers still floated, but their air groups were gone, shredded in the sky long before they could inflict meaningful damage. Admiral Ozawa had hurled the bulk of Japan's remaining air power into the fight and watched it vanish in a single day. The scale was impossible by any pre-war imagination. The United States now destroyed in one afternoon more Japanese planes than it had lost in the entire attack on Pearl Harbor. The Empire's dream of air supremacy dissolved into wreckage on the sea. As darkness fell, radar scopes still hummed, sweeping silently across the Pacific. The men in the CICs knew they had witnessed something historic. This was not just a victory. It was the moment Japan's naval air arm ceased to exist. Spring 1945. The island of Okinawa loomed as America's next great stepping stone, and with it came the largest fleet operation of the Pacific War. Hundreds of ships, carriers, battleships, transports, and escorts formed a vast armada. At its outer edge, small destroyers and gunboats took up lonely stations, far ahead of the main body. These were the radar pickets, the fleet's eyes and early warning line. By then, the Japanese had learned a bitter truth. American radar was robbing them of surprise. Each great strike had been blunted, each kamikaze wave intercepted before it could reach the carriers. In desperation, Imperial planners devised a grim new tactic. If radar was the eyes of the fleet, then the eyes must be blinded first. The pickets became primary targets. On the morning of April 6, 1945, the first of the Kikusui raids thundered toward Okinawa. Waves of kamikaze aircraft, Army and Navy together, hurled against the American Armada. Instead of striking carriers or transports, many peeled off toward the lonely dots on the horizon, where the picket destroyers stood guard. From their cockpits, Japanese pilots had been briefed. Kill the pickets, and the Americans will no longer see us coming. For the crews of those ships, the assignment was both an honor and a death sentence. To stand picket was to absorb the first blow, to fight with little chance of relief. Lieutenant, junior grade, George Finnegan of the USS Cassin Young, DD 793, later described it as a tremendous psychological experience. The knowledge that at any hour the horizon could erupt with kamikazes bearing down on your thin hull. The sea spray and exhaust fumes mixed with the constant smell of burnt powder. Men lived at battle stations, nerves fraying with each radar contact that might be another suicide plane. Technically, the pickets were well armed. Each destroyer bristled with 5-inch/38 caliber dual-purpose guns, many now firing shells fitted with VT proximity fuses, the miniature miracles that detonated when near a target, effectively giving the shells their own sense of sight. The ships also carried dozens of 40mm and 20mm guns for close defense. Radar sets like the SM Fighter Direction Radar fed bearing and range into the CIC, where fighter directors tried to vector CAP fighters before the enemy arrived. On paper, the system worked. In practice, the kamikazes came too fast and too many. That day, more than 350 Japanese aircraft were committed to the attack. Many were destroyed far from target, but enough slipped through to make their point. Picket stations became charnel houses. The destroyer USS Bush took 3 kamikaze hits in 5 minutes and went down. Others limped away, decks torn open, crew dead and wounded. Smoke columns rose from the horizon like signal flares of sacrifice. The Japanese pilots believed they were cutting away the fleet's eyes. In reality, the Americans simply shifted more ships forward, filled the gaps, and kept the radar net intact. The United States could afford to waste brand new destroyers on the picket line because industry would replace them. Japan, by contrast, was burning through its last reserves of trained aviators. Each kamikaze lost was irreplaceable. For the Americans who survived, the irony was bitter. They knew they had become targets not because they were weak, but because they were vital. The very fact that the Japanese hurled themselves at the pickets proved how important radar had become. A Japanese officer captured later admitted, "We thought if we destroyed your warning stations, we might reach your carriers." But every time, more ships appeared. By June, after 10 massive Kikusui raids, the pattern was clear. Pickets would burn, men would die, but the fleet endured. Radar could be blinded temporarily, never permanently. The system was simply too deep, too redundant, too well supplied. The Japanese had shifted their fury onto the eyes of the fleet, but the eyes never truly closed. April 1945. The sea around Okinawa rolled under a stiff wind, whitecaps breaking against the hull of the USS Cassin Young DD 793. She was one of dozens of destroyers scattered in lonely arcs around the invasion fleet, each anchored to a fixed coordinate known as a radar picket station. To her crew, it felt less like a station and more like a spotlight. Everyone knew that when the Japanese came, they would come here first. Life on the picket line was an endless watch. Radar operators hunched over scopes, eyes aching from the green glow. Every faint blip sent a chill through the compartment. Sometimes it was only a wandering weather echo, a flock of seabirds, or a straggling American patrol returning late. Other times it was the opening of another day in hell. Finnegan, the young lieutenant who kept watch in the CIC, later recalled how the tension never left. It was a tremendous psychological experience, he said, struggling to put into words the mix of dread and duty that came with each radar contact. The Japanese knew exactly what they were doing. By April, their planners had concluded that surprise was gone. The only way to reach the carriers was to blind the Americans first. That meant the pickets had to die. And so each new Kikusui raid hurled waves of kamikazes directly at the thin line of destroyers. The sky could be empty one minute and filled with specks the next, engines buzzing like hornets as pilots drove themselves straight into American steel. Technically, the destroyers were bristling with defenses. The 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns fired shells with the miraculous VT proximity fuse, each round capable of exploding within yards of a target. Radar-directed fire control gave those shells uncanny accuracy. Smaller 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikons barked a deadly wall of lead at closer ranges. In theory, it was enough to stop any attacker. In practice, the kamikazes came low, fast, and determined. Some were shredded in bursts of black flak blossoms. Others slipped through the barrage and smashed into decks at suicidal speed. On April 12th, a swarm of suicide planes descended on Cassanyung Station. The CIC called vectors for CAP Hellcats, but several slipped through. Gunners screamed bearings and opened fire, the ship vibrating under the recoil. Smoke stung the eyes, brass casings clattered underfoot. 1-0 burst apart under a VT-fused round, showering fragments across the water. Another slammed into the sea just yards from the destroyer's beam, the concussion rocking men off their feet. Hours later, the decks were still littered with twisted metal and the acrid stink of cordite. The pattern repeated across the picket line. USS Bush was hit 3 times in 5 minutes and sank with heavy loss. USS Laffey survived what seemed impossible. Attacks by 22 kamikazes and 4 bombs in 80 minutes. Her crew fought back with everything they had, some gunners firing machine guns until their barrels warped from heat. Survivors remembered the air so thick with smoke and fire that the sun itself seemed dimmed. The Japanese believed these sacrifices would open a path to the fleet. Instead, they only delayed their own destruction. Each time a destroyer fell, another took its place. The Americans could afford it. Factories back home turned out destroyers and electronics in numbers the Japanese could scarcely comprehend. One historian later noted that the United States lost more destroyers on the picket line than Japan had built in some entire years of the war, yet the line never broke. For the sailors living it, there was little comfort in the arithmetic of abundance. They felt only the exhaustion of perpetual readiness, the sting of loss, when a sister ship disappeared in smoke, the gnawing awareness that their own number might be next. Yet they held their stations day after day, blips after blip, because the fleet behind them depended on those glowing screens. The pickets burned, but the fleet endured. And the Japanese pilots who aimed at them learned that even in death, they had struck only the outermost eyes of a vision too vast to blind. By May 1945, the Okinawa campaign had turned into a grim arithmetic problem. Each new week brought another Kikusui raid, waves of kamikaze aircraft launched from Kyushu with orders to smash the American fleet. At the start, they came in terrifying numbers, over 100 planes diving out of the clouds in a single day. By the end, the formations dwindled to a fraction of that. The numbers told a story of exhaustion. On April 6th, more than 350 kamikazes participated in the first Great Raid. By June 21st, the final effort mustered barely 45 aircraft. Japanese commanders still issued the same orders, and pilots still went willingly, but the scale shrank with every attempt. America's defenses had not only blunted the attacks, they had ground down Japan's very ability to fight. For the men on radar picket duty, the shrinking raids were little comfort. A single kamikaze was still enough to kill a ship. The tension of watching the scopes remained constant, and the chaos of sudden attack felt no less deadly with fewer planes in the sky. Yet for the planners in Washington and Pearl Harbor, the trend was unmistakable. Japanese air power was collapsing in real time, and radar had given the Americans the luxury of measuring that collapse raid by raid. The contrast between American abundance and Japanese scarcity had never been starker. In 1945 alone, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft. Japan, racked by bombing and fuel shortages, managed fewer than 9,000. One American plant, Ford's massive Willow Run factory in Michigan, turned out more B-24 Liberators in a single month than Japan built fighters in an entire year. It was an impossible statistic, the kind of industrial gap no battlefield courage could bridge. That abundance stretched far beyond aircraft. Radar sets, proximity fuses, ammunition, every component of the invisible defense web around Okinawa flowed from American factories in quantities the Japanese could scarcely imagine. Destroyers lost on the picket line were replaced by new hulls steaming across the Pacific within weeks. Radar operators were trained faster than Japan could replace pilots. Where Japanese planners spoke in terms of conserving resources, American officers spoke in terms of deploying more. The difference was existential. For the Japanese pilots climbing into cockpits with the rising sun, the imbalance was visible even before they reached the target. Waves that once stretched from horizon to horizon had dwindled to loose clusters of aircraft patched together from whatever could still fly. Some carried inexperienced teenagers, others flew older, slower planes barely fit for combat. Against them waited American cap squadrons of Hellcats, vectored by radar into perfect intercept positions, armed with radios, fuel, and ammunition in quantities that seemed endless. On the ground in Kyushu, mechanics scrounged for parts and siphoned fuel from training planes just to launch another kamikaze. Meanwhile, in stateside classrooms, Ensign Margaret Doyle and thousands of other trainees cycled through radar courses, their textbooks brand new, their headsets gleaming, their supply lines unbroken. Every week that passed, the Americans added to their skill and their numbers, while Japan spent the last of its irreplaceable strength. The men aboard Cassin Young and her sister pickets could not see the factories or the classrooms, but they lived the results. Each time a radar blip appeared, CAP squadrons were ready. Each time a kamikaze closed the distance, there were enough guns, enough shells, enough ships to meet it. The fleet behind them remained unscathed, the invasion of Okinawa unbroken, because America's abundance filled every gap. By June, the dwindling Japanese raids had become less a tactical threat than a tragic spectacle. Courage was still there, but scale was gone. The Empire's last resource, its young men, was being spent faster than it could be replaced. And the Americans, with their invisible wall of radar and their industrial ocean of machines, absorbed the fury without breaking stride. The arithmetic of war had become simple. Scarcity met surplus, and surplus always prevailed. The kamikaze dived steeply, engines screaming, wings trembling as the pilot aimed his aircraft like a spear toward the gray shape of an American destroyer. The crew below fired frantically, 5-inch guns booming, 40mm mounts chattering, 20mm tracers streaking into the blue. Then, with no visible contact, a 5-inch shell burst directly beside the plane, tearing it apart in midair. Pieces of fuselage rained into the sea. The crew cheered, bewildered. How had the shell known where to explode? It was no miracle. It was technology, specifically the VT variable time proximity fuse, one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Developed by American scientists and produced on an industrial scale, the fuse carried a miniature radar set inside each shell. When the round came close to an aircraft, the radio signal reflected back, triggering detonation at exactly the right moment. The result was devastating. Instead of relying on a direct hit or a timed burst, every shell now carried its own invisible sense of sight. By 1945, the effects were undeniable. Though VT rounds made up only about a quarter of all 5-inch ammunition fired, they accounted for more than half of aerial kills by shipboard anti-aircraft fire. Japanese pilots began to notice. Survivors reported seeing aircraft explode seemingly without being touched. One described shells that burst in the air near us as if they could see. To men raised on Bushido and the certainty of steel meeting steel, it seemed unnatural, even supernatural. On the picket line, these fuses meant survival. Radar-directed fire control systems already allowed destroyers to track and engage aircraft at greater ranges than ever before. With VT shells, each burst filled the sky with lethal fragments at exactly the point of closest approach. Kamikazes that might have once slipped through walls of fire were now shredded hundreds of yards short of their targets. For gunners, the change was transformative. Instead of firing hundreds of rounds for a lucky hit, now a handful could decide the outcome. The production numbers were staggering. American factories manufactured 22 million VT fuses during the war, each a masterpiece of miniaturization. To put that in perspective, Japan produced fewer than 30,000 aircraft engines in 1945. In 1 year, America made more shells with radar brains than Japan made engines for its entire air force. It was an impossible statistic, proof that abundance and innovation had fused into a weapon system the enemy could not comprehend. For sailors, the experience was visceral. Gunners remembered the acrid tang of burnt powder, the brass casings clattering ankle-deep around their stations, the shockwave of each 5-inch round hammering their chests. When a kamikaze disintegrated mid-dive, there was often a stunned pause, as if even the men pulling the triggers were trying to grasp what had happened. Then came relief, and the knowledge that one more ship had been spared. For Japanese aviators, it was despair. Already facing radar-guided fighters before reaching the fleet, they now had to run a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire that seemed almost alive. Every attack became more costly, every mission more certain to fail. Bushido taught them to embrace death, but technology was erasing even the chance of inflicting equal damage in return. The VT fuse was not glamorous. It had no silhouette to admire, no heroic story of a pilot's duel, yet it was among the most decisive weapons of the Pacific War. It turned every American gun crew into a machine of precision, magnified by radar and multiplied by industry. By the summer of 1945, Japanese pilots had begun to accept a grim truth. Even the shells themselves now had eyes. In the summer of 1945, the Pacific was not only a battlefield of ships and planes, it was a battlefield of factories, blueprints, and assembly lines. The clash between Japan and the United States had become a war of arithmetic, and the numbers were merciless. Every radar picket ship, every VT fuse, every Hellcat fighter circling above Okinawa existed because of a production machine so vast that even America's enemies marveled at it. In New Jersey, women in headscarves and overalls bent over long tables assembling vacuum tubes by the thousands, each destined for a radar set that would sweep the skies of the Pacific. In Michigan, Ford's Willow Run plant turned out a new B-24 Liberator every hour, day and night, 7 days a week. In Connecticut, machinists at proximity fuse factories packed tiny radio circuits into millions of 5-inch shells. These places never saw the flash of kamikazes or the glow of a radar scope, but they were as much a part of Okinawa as the sailors standing watch on the picket line. The Japanese had nothing comparable. By 1945, their economy was strangled by blockade, their factories bombed into ruins, their oil supplies nearly gone. Fuel was so scarce that training flights were reduced to minutes. Engines failed for lack of parts. Mechanics cannibalized one grounded plane to keep another aloft. Aircraft production, once ambitious, had collapsed to a trickle. Japan produced fewer than 9,000 aircraft in 1945, not even 1/10 of America's output. In that same year, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft, an impossible figure that dwarfed everything Japan could hope to build. The imbalance extended beyond aircraft. The United States manufactured 22 million VT fuses during the war. Japan never managed to produce a single one. American radar sets poured off assembly lines in the thousands, each one more advanced than anything Japan had in its arsenal. By the end of the war, the Navy had fitted nearly every major vessel with radar, while Japanese ships relied on human eyes and guesswork. The scale of waste itself became a weapon. A destroyer lost on the picket line could be replaced in weeks, its hull already under construction before the first had even left the yard. American officers spoke casually of rotating fresh ships into the radar net, a luxury that would have been unimaginable to the Japanese, who watched each vessel lost as an irreplaceable wound. One American historian later noted that the United States lost more destroyers at Okinawa alone than Japan managed to build during entire years of the war, yet the line never faltered. Inside the CIC of a picket ship, sailors could feel this abundance in subtle ways. There were always spare tubes for a radar set, always more ammunition ready to be hauled up to the guns, always another flight of Hellcats ready to be vectored from the carriers. The system seemed bottomless. Ensign Margaret Doyle, training new radar operators stateside, marveled at the turnover. Every time we graduated a class, another one was waiting, she remembered. It felt endless. For Japan, by contrast, every pilot sent on a kamikaze mission was one less that could ever be replaced. The numbers war had already been decided long before Okinawa. Radar and fuses, Hellcats and Liberators, these were not isolated marvels, but the products of a society that had mobilized its entire economy for victory. American democracy had built an arsenal so overwhelming that even mistakes, even losses, even waste were absorbed without pause. Japan, locked in scarcity, was fighting an enemy that could replace in a single day what it took them months to build. By the summer of 1945, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The factories had won the war as surely as the fleets. The men at the scopes and the women at the benches were part of the same machine. And the machine was unstoppable. June 21st, 1945. The final organized kamikaze raid of the Okinawa campaign lifted off from Kyushu under gray skies heavy with rain. Barely 45 aircraft stumbled into formation. Old Zeros, worn-out bombers, a handful of hastily modified trainers. Some carried boys who had logged less than 10 hours of flight time. Others flew on engines coughing black smoke before they even left the runway. This was all Japan had left. The plan was the same as always. Reach the picket line, blind the radar, and then strike the fleet. But the pattern had become predictable, and the Americans were ready. On the destroyer USS Cassin Young, the radar scope lit up with faint blips long before anyone on deck could see them. The fighter director officer calmly called bearings, his voice level after months of practice. Vector red section, Angels 12, bogies 270, range 70. Hellcats were already climbing, their throttles wide open, radios crackling with acknowledgement. By the time the Japanese formation crossed the halfway mark, it was in tatters. Radar-guided fighters slashed through from above, breaking up the group into isolated singles. Those that pressed on found themselves flying into a wall of radar-directed anti-aircraft fire, shells fitted with VT fuses bursting in the air around them. To the defenders, it was systematic. To the attackers, it was a gauntlet of steel and fire with no way through. Only a handful of kamikazes reached the picket line. Cassin Young took a near miss. 1-0 splashing down in flames just yards from her starboard side, the impact rattling dishes in the galley. Other destroyers were struck, some damaged, some sunk, but the fleet itself remained untouched. Behind the pickets, the carriers and transports continued their work unmolested, the invasion of Okinawa proceeding inexorably toward conclusion. For the Japanese pilots, the shock was not in death. They had accepted that before takeoff. It was in the futility. The certainty of surprise, once the sharpest edge of their doctrine, had been dulled beyond repair. They had been seen before they struck every time, raid after raid, until the act of launching itself felt like walking into a known trap. Captain Takahisa Amagi, reflecting years later, admitted the bitter truth. Radar denied us surprise. We could not reach you unseen. It was the end of our air arm. His words echoed the experience of countless aviators who never returned. The casualty figures told the same story in merciless numbers. Across the Okinawa campaign, Japan had hurled over 1,900 kamikaze aircraft against the American fleet. They sank 36 ships and damaged more than 300 others, a heavy toll but not decisive. The carriers, the transports, the core of the fleet all survived. America absorbed the punishment and kept advancing. Japan, meanwhile, had thrown away its last trained pilots, its last aircraft, its last hope of parity in the skies. For men like Lieutenant Junior Grade Finnegan aboard Cassin Young, the final raid brought not triumph, but exhaustion. He remembered staring at the radar screen as the last blips faded, thinking only of the silence that followed. It was not relief so much as emptiness. The enemy was finished, but the cost had been high, and the sea was filled with the memory of burning ships and lost friends. Still, the strategic truth could not be ignored. The Japanese had gambled their empire on the power of surprise, and radar had erased it. What began in a wooden shack on Midway had matured into a network of eyes that never blinked, never slept, never failed to see the enemy coming. By June 1945, surprise was no longer part of Japan's arsenal. It belonged to the Americans, who wielded it with electrons instead of shadows. The Pacific War was entering its final act, and Japan was out of illusions. Decades after the guns of Okinawa fell silent, an old man sat in his living room, the glow of a television flickering across his face. On the screen, sleek jet fighters streaked across the sky, guided by satellites and computers. He shook his head softly. In 1942, he had been a radar operator on Midway, staring into the green light of an SCR-270, logging ranges with a trembling pencil. The thought came unbidden. We started this with nothing but blips on a screen, and it changed the world. The legacy of radar stretched far beyond the Pacific Islands, where it had proven itself. After the war, the same principles hardened into doctrine. The United States built the Distant Early Warning Line, a chain of radars across the Arctic, designed to spot Soviet bombers before they reached American cities. The same technology guided anti-aircraft missiles, tracked satellites, and eventually formed the backbone of NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command. What began as experimental equipment on lonely atolls became a permanent shield for the free world. For veterans, the memories were more personal. Sailors remembered the acrid smell of burnt powder, the metallic taste of fear during kamikaze dives, the steady hum of the radar set in the dark. They remembered the weight of knowing that their calm voice on the radio could send pilots to life or death. Ensign Margaret Doyle, years later, would describe the work as learning to see for men who could not see themselves. The responsibility never left her. For the Japanese who survived, the lesson was bitter but undeniable. Surprise had been the Empire's weapon, the heart of its strategy from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean raids. Radar stripped it away. Captain Amagi's words during interrogation captured it plainly. Radar denied them surprise, and with it, denied them victory. By the end of Okinawa, even the bravest pilots knew they were flying into the gaze of an enemy that would always see them first. The statistics stood as monuments of their own. The United States had produced 96,000 aircraft in 1945 alone. Japan produced fewer than 9,000. American factories turned out millions of shells with radar-guided fuses, more than the enemy could hope to match with engines or airframes. One factory at Willow Run produced more bombers in a month than Japan did fighters in a year. These were not just numbers. They were the measure of a democracy that armed its citizen soldiers with overwhelming force, and a totalitarian empire that could not keep pace. Yet behind the statistics were faces. The sailors on picket destroyers who knew they were bait. The pilots vectored into combat by voices from a darkened room. The women in factories who soldered circuits into shells. The Marines who first logged a blip on a screen at Midway and realized something vast had shifted. Their collective effort turned radar from a fragile experiment into a decisive weapon. By the end of the war, the phrase "early warning" no longer sounded experimental. It was a promise, one written in electrons and production lines, in the unbroken vigilance of men and women who never looked away. The Pacific had been made transparent, and the empire that once ruled by surprise had been defeated by vision. As the veteran leaned back from his television, he could still recall the hum of the set, the smell of the shack, the sweep of the green line across the screen. It had been his world once, and through it, he had glimpsed the future. America's enemies learned too late that the free world had built eyes that never closed,